Hey guys, Matt from Eastwood. We're here in my home garage, and today we're going to do a quick little tech talk on welding wire for your MIG welder. We oftentimes get a lot of questions about what type of welding can I do with my Eastwood MIG welder and what wire should I choose for the job that I'm working on. So we're going to go into the different types of MIG wire, where they're used, and just give you a basic breakdown so that you are more educated to choose the right MIG wire for the right job. So let's get started. Alright, so the first thing we're going to talk about is how does your MIG wire feed and what size spool of wire should I get when I'm welding. So MIG wire is fed pretty simply. There is a spool that is inside of your machine. No matter what brand or type of welder you have, there will be a MIG spool that is traditionally inside of the machine, and then there's going to be a drive motor with a series of rollers that will basically keep the wire smooth. It'll grab it and pulls it through the machine into your MIG gun, which is right here. So when you hit this trigger, depending on the settings you have in your machine, it will feed the wire from inside your machine all the way through your torch lead, and it will come out here, and simultaneously as you hit this trigger, it will also strike an arc when this wire touches your workpiece. So as far as feeding the wire goes, you don't really have to do a lot. Depending on the machine you have, you may need to dial in your settings as far as your heat and your wire speed goes. If you have an Eastwood machine, pretty much all of the machines have a chart here that's a quick start, so it will get you set up for the size of wire you're using, and then also the heat range and the wire speed that you need to get a pretty decent weld, and then you can adjust it from there using the infinite adjustment on any of the Eastwood machines. So the size of spool, you may notice that inside this machine I have a larger spool that's inside of here versus what I have in my hand here. So this is the most common size, the 2-pound spool that you will see used most commonly on home hobbyist size welders. Pretty much your welder will have a rating inside of it as far as the size spool that it can take, but most smaller welders, especially if you're using a 110 or 120 volt input machine, it will use a spool like this. When you get into the 220 input machines that have higher amperage, a lot of times they will jump up in the size of the spool that it can take. And then of course some of the larger units, like I have with the MIG 250 MP250i here, you can see this only takes the larger spools here. So you may need to go to that larger spool if you have a larger machine, but it is necessary if you have these larger machines, because you're welding at higher amperage, you're going to be feeding more wire and using a lot more wire. So if you have a smaller machine, so for instance some of our 220 volt machines like the MIG MP200 and some of those machines, they actually have the ability to use both the smaller 2-pound spools and some of the larger spools like you see in this machine. What you need to keep in mind is how much do you weld, especially MIG wire that is mild steel MIG wire like the ER70S-6. That wire can, over time, can corrode. So if you have it in a shop that is not heat controlled, or maybe is a damp shop, or if it's just sitting, the machine is sitting around, that wire over time can actually rust just a little bit, and when you feed it through the machine, not only will it damage your liner, it will also give you a dirty weld that may seem like you're doing something wrong, but it could actually just be that your MIG wire has been sitting around far too long. So definitely judge the size of the spool that you get if you have that option on your machine by the amount of wire that you're going to be using and the amount of welding you're going to be doing. I weld pretty much every other day in my shop, so I use a lot of wire in my machine, so I usually like to keep the bigger spools in there, so it saves me trips to buying new wire, and I don't have to change out the wire every time I go to weld. So when you're picking your wire, definitely look at your machine, see what it can fit, and then think about how much you're going to be welding and stock up with that type of wire and the size wire that you think, size spool that you think will work. Alright, so next thing we're going to cover is what size spool of wire should I get for my machine. So there is a variety of size of spools, or they're commonly referred to by the weight of the spool or the weight of the wire that comes on it. So the one you see here is probably the most common that you will find in most stores. It fits most home hobbyist entry-level to mid-level machines and lower amperage machines that are pretty much like 200 amps and down. You will see this most commonly used in those, and that is a 2-pound spool. There are spools that go up in size to kind of an infinite level. Depending on industrial welding that's automated, you may get a spool that's, you know, hundreds of pounds, weighs hundreds of pounds. But if you're using a MIG welder in your home shop, 2 pound or a 10 or 11 pound, depending on how your spool is measured, is the most common sizes. So if you have a welder that is like for instance, a 110 or 120 volt input welder, 99% chance that it will really only use, or most commonly use, these 2 pound spools, which works just fine for, you know, occasional use. Now, if you have a larger welder that is a 220 welder, input welder, and is like 200 amps and up, your machine most likely will come with the option to use either or. And then when you get into the larger machines like 250 amps and up, a lot of times they don't even fit these smaller spools. So I have the MP250i, and this machine takes the larger 10 or 11 pound spools only, so I cannot use these small spools in my machine. But really with these spools, when you're welding at higher amperage, you're feeding the wire a lot faster. So you will blow through one of these in an afternoon. If you're welding something at 200, 250 amps, you're gonna blow through one of these small spools really, really quickly. So it makes sense to go to the larger spool. Now, if your machine has either or, that you could fit it, like some of the 220 machines that we offer have a adapter that comes with the machine that you can put the larger spools on your machine. You need to decide, do I need the larger spool or not? If you're just doing occasional welding where you may weld a couple times a year or maybe once a month or something like that, realistically you're not going to need the big 10, 11 pound spool, and you can get away with a 2 pound spool. One thing to keep in mind, if you're welding just once or twice a month or once a year and you're not welding consistently, your welding wire can actually start to corrode or rust in the machine just from the humidity outside or the changes in temperature with the seasons, depending on where you live. And you can actually have welding wire that will go bad just from sitting in the machine. And you go to weld and you may get porosity in your weld, or it's spitting and spattering. That could be because your wire has gone bad and actually has rust or corrosion on the wire throughout the whole entire spool, and there's really no good way to clean the wire so you can use it again. So don't get the big spool if you only weld once in a while and you're doing small jobs, because more than likely that wire is going to go bad before you end up using the whole entire spool. But just choose a wire size spool that'll work best for you. Again, my machine only takes the larger spool. I weld at higher amperage with my MIG most commonly, so I run through the 2 pound spools in like no time. So I end up using these big spools. Definitely is a game changer for me with this MP250i. All right, next thing, what type of welding can I do with my machine and what wire do I need to use? So as a blanket statement for a home hobbyist, you can pretty much weld most any material that you're going to come across, metals that you could come across, especially the most common ones that you will run into. Now, there is some specialty material, obviously, that you can't weld that you wouldn't see in just a home shop, but for a blanket statement, you can weld most things as long as you have the correct shielding gas, the correct wire. You can weld the most common materials like mild steel, stainless steel, and aluminum, which are kind of like the big ones. You can weld all of those with a MIG welder, but there is some things that you need to make sure that you have so that you can actually weld correctly with that. So the most common wire to use for mild steel is a ER70S-6 or -2. In my machine, I have the ER70S-6. That's the most common and easiest to find MIG wire. This is kind of like your middle ground MIG wire. The numbers that you may see, if you want to really dive in deep with what the letters and numbers mean for the MIG wire, it basically changes the chemical makeup or the properties of your MIG wire, and it will change how the wire reacts. But really, for the home hobbyist, there will be minimal differences that you probably wouldn't notice unless you're doing something that's very specialized, and the little changes in those numbers won't mean a lot to you or I when we're just welding on a home project or on a classic car. So reach for the ER70S-2 or -6, and that will set you up for welding mild steel. On the topic of welding mild steel, a question that we get a lot, especially with entry-level welders, is can my welder do gasless welding? So a wire welder that can do gasless welding. So as a rule of thumb, all true MIG welders that are set up to use gas can weld without gas using flux core wire, which is meant for gasless welding. If you have a machine that is a wire welder and is kind of like an entry-level machine, you definitely want to check it to make sure that it does have the option to weld with gas to make it a true MIG welder and not just a wire feed welder that only does flux core welding. Flux core wire is much like just the standard ER70S that we were talking about earlier, but it has a coating on it that basically is a flux that when you light the weld up or you strike an arc and melt the wire, it is going to create that shielding gas without having to have an actual separate shielding gas. So it will allow you to weld without having any shielding gas, because when this melts, it will melt and it will create a gas around the weld that will keep it from getting porosity or contaminants in the weld when you're welding. Now, the downside to having flux core, if you're doing sheet metal work or you're doing something that's a little more thin or intricate, is that because of the flux core wire and the coating that it has on it, the diameter of the wire just by nature is larger. The smallest that you can get is this 035 wire in the flux core nature or type of flux core wire, and with standard solid core MIG wire like we talked about earlier, the ER70, you can go much lower into 023 and things like that that are a little better for welding thin like 20 gauge sheet metal. So flux core wire is really good for welding if you have to weld somewhere that you have a breeze, say outside or something like that, where the shielding gas would get blown away. Flux core wire is really great for that. It's great for welding out in the field and different things like that. It's also great for just getting your feet wet. If you're doing some welding, you don't want to invest in a bottle and the regulator and all that stuff. You can get welding, get the process down, because the actual process of MIG welding is the same as far as your technique goes with the flux core wire as it is when you're using a true MIG function with the gas. You can use the flux core wire especially for heavier fabrication. It definitely works really well for that type of stuff, and that's where I would reach for it if I was doing heavy fabrication outside, like on a tractor or something like that. It works really, really well. But make sure that you're using the correct wire with your machine. If you try and put solid core standard MIG wire into a flux core only machine, it will not weld. You'll get porosity because it does need that gas that the flux core wire creates when it burns. Alright, so probably one of the most common questions that we get about MIG welding is, can I weld aluminum with my MIG welder? And as a rule of thumb, yes, a MIG welder can weld aluminum if you have the correct shielding gas and you have the correct attachments on your welder to weld aluminum. So most Eastwood MIG welders come with the option that you can weld aluminum with the machine right out of the box, or you can buy a spool gun to weld aluminum with your MIG welder. So what is a spool gun? A spool gun is definitely necessary if you're welding aluminum with your MIG welder. The reason is that the MIG wire and aluminum as a whole is a softer material, and unlike the MIG wire for using mild steel or even stainless wire or flux core, the wire is so soft that if you try and feed it through your MIG lead, it will end up binding up and bunching up because of the friction inside of there and how soft this is. So by having a spool gun, you're going to have your MIG wire right on top of your MIG gun, and it'll feed right out of there, right onto the workpiece, and you don't have a long reach where it's going to get bunched up or get damaged in the process as you're welding. So you definitely need a spool gun attachment to do aluminum welding. Most welders that are quality welders have the option that you can buy a spool gun, and some of them even come with them. So what type of wire do you need? You need aluminum wire to weld aluminum. Crazy, I know, right? So back to the properties or the makeup of the wire like we talked about earlier. The type of wire that you want to look for that's most common is the ER4043. That's what you will find with MIG welding. That is probably the most common. So the numbers for aluminum, the easiest way to remember it is by the series, like 4000 series, 3000 series, etc., etc. The lower the number that of wire they will get, the softer the aluminum is and the easier it is to work. So you, as a whole, generally for just general repairs and welding, the 4000 series or the ER4043 is the best all-around one because it's kind of middle of the road. When you get into something that is a bit softer like that, it may not work for the MIG process or structural welding because the wire is so soft. And if you get something that is a lot harder than that, the weld may not end up being very, very hard and harder than the material around it. So if you can figure out what you're welding, the makeup of the aluminum, try and match it as close as possible. But again, the 4000 series MIG aluminum MIG wire seems to be the best and definitely works all around. Now the diameter of the wire, you're going to pick that depending on the thickness of the material that you're welding. This right here I have pretty much one of the thinnest you're going to use, and that's 030 or 8mm wire. Now you can go up in diameters of wire to do more structural welds or repairs, something like welding an aluminum wheel that may have a crack or damage from running against a curb. You may use something that's a little thicker because you're going to be welding at a higher amperage because the casting is much thicker. So you may want to look for a 035, 040, something like that to weld with that, so that you can get a lot of material deposited and you can put the heat into the part to get it welded properly. So the other thing you need to get when you're welding aluminum with a MIG welder is you need to change your gas that you're welding with, your shielding gas, and you would need 100% argon versus having your mix bottle that's going to be your CO2 argon mix. So by having a 100% argon bottle on hand, switching over to that with your spool gun, with your aluminum wire, you can weld aluminum with your MIG welder and get some pretty good results after you do some practicing. All right, the last common material that we're going to cover and welding wire we're going to cover for MIG welding is stainless steel welding with a MIG application. So MIG welding can weld stainless steel no problem at all. Now again, you do need to have the correct welding wire to do that if you want a long-lasting weld. So it is true, if you look online, you could probably read or you've heard of people talk about, you can weld stainless steel with a mild steel like the ER70S. You can weld the two of those together and it will fuse the metal together and it will work if you're trying to weld, say, a stainless exhaust using that mild wire. What does happen though is your weld seam is going to rust, and if it's going to rust out, it's going to rust at that point. So the reason for using stainless steel and the fact that it doesn't corrode, kind of you negate that property by welding with mild steel wire. So it's best to get stainless steel wire. So the most common one you're going to see is the 308L series is the most common you will see for welding stainless steel with your MIG welder. And that is kind of, again, like we've talked about, a lot of this is the middle of the ground wire that you're going to use. And if you use your stainless wire with your MIG welder while welding stainless, it's going to give you a nice weld that is not going to rust or corrode almost instantly like if you were using your mild stainless wire. So when you're welding with that, the process is basically the same. Just make sure that the metal is very, very clean, because like aluminum, stainless also needs a very clean surface to get a nice, clean, structurally sound weld. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about in our little tech tip talk today on MIG wire is the diameter of the MIG wire that you use. This is something where I see a lot of mistakes being made with people that are just learning how to weld, or possibly if you're a home hobbyist for a while, you may not have thought of some of these little tidbits that I'm going to talk about. So first thing with the diameter is, if we're going to be talking about light duty welding like sheet metal and thinner applications, is using too thick of a diameter of MIG wire on the panel or part that you're trying to weld. So if you're doing sheet metal repair that is, say, 20 gauge, and you're putting a 20 gauge patch panel into your car, and you have problems where the second you hit the wire, strike an arc, it blows a big hole in the panel, and you just end up making more and more holes, and it's having trouble getting a nice flat weld without melting the material away, you may want to look at the diameter of MIG wire that you have in your machine. The wire that you use for sheet metal repair is a lot different in size than the welding you're going to be using to do like chassis repair or fabrication. So as a rule of thumb, the best thing to do is try and match the diameter of your wire as close in diameter as the thickness of the sheet metal that you're welding. So if you're welding 20 gauge steel, you don't want to be using 035 wire like you may use for heavier fabrication, because the heat that it takes to actually melt that 030 or 035 wire into the 20 gauge steel is much higher than what it takes for the 20 gauge. So of course it's going to burn away the thinner material first, which is your sheet metal. So try jumping down to an 023 wire, and that will give you a much better results when you're welding sheet metal, because it is a lot closer in thickness and the heat that it takes to melt as the material that you're welding. Now if you're welding 18 gauge, 16 gauge, and working your way up in some of the heavier sheet metals, you may want to jump up to like an 030, and that's about as thick as I go for welding sheet metal. Now when you get into heavier fabrication, the 030 can work pretty well. That's kind of like the middle of the road welding wire, that if I'm going to say you're on a budget and you just want to get one spool wire that will, thickness of wire that will kind of get you around on most jobs, 030 is probably the best one for that, because with the right technique you can weld some sheet metal with it, but you can also crank your machine up in your wire speed and weld some heavier fabrication. Now if you're doing heavier fabrication like on a chassis where you're welding 3/16 or 1/4 inch plate, or even if you're doing a lot of 1/8 inch, the 030 you're going to probably start just running through that, because the wire speed has to be cranked so high to get enough wire to feed out at the temperature that it takes to melt that wire into that heavier material. So you may want to jump up to like an 035 type wire. Now make sure that your machine has a roller and consumables that can actually take that larger wire, because you do need to match all of the parts of your machine with the wire you're welding with. So the nozzle or tip that's in your welder, that needs to be the correct size. If it's too large, you may not get a good contact when you're welding. If it's too small, obviously the wire is not going to feed through. And then also on the rollers on your machine, on the Eastwood machine, a lot of times you can switch the rollers around to the wire that you're using. There'll be 2 or 3 different grooves that are cut in that for the different types of wires. So make sure you have that set correct, because if you have too small of a, if you're using the smaller roller on there for the grooves, you may crush your wire in a larger wire, or it may slip if you have the large opening and small wire. So make sure to have all those things set correct, and you get your welding wire set up for the type of material that you're welding with, and it should be set pretty good. If you have an Eastwood machine, again, it comes with this handy chart here, and it will give you basically a no-go, go or no-go kind of chart that will tell you the type of material as far as thickness goes, the welding wire thickness, and your wire speed. If it's blanked out in there, that probably means that you're out of the range or the normal operating range of that wire and or the machine that you're working with. So again, if you're just looking for an all-around size of wire to get, the 030 is really good, but I would definitely get some 023 if you plan on doing any type of sheet metal around the shop. Hopefully this little talk about MIG wire and will jumpstart you with your MIG welding and choosing the correct wire and consumables that you want to use. If you want to learn about all the MIG welding supplies that we have, you can click the link down below, or you can visit eastwood.com to get all the tools you need to do the job right. Thanks guys, catch you later.